Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we'll get started if that's okay. It's 10:32. I know that we have a lot to talk about, so we are all eager to get this conversation going. Welcome, everyone. I'm Marian Dixie, Director of Student Affairs and Associate Professor of Teaching here at the School of Social Work, and welcome to our Voting is Social Work event. We are glad you can all join us today for a conversation on the importance of voter registration and the challenge of voter suppression in the 2020 election. I have the pleasure of introducing Marla Blunt-Carter, who is an assistant professor of professional practice here at Rutgers. She currently teaches courses focused on management and policy, but has also taught many other courses in both the BASW program and the MSW program here. Prior to teaching, Marla worked as a macro social worker in government settings and nonprofit organizations. She served as the project manager and director of constituent services in the Senate office of then U.S. Senator Joe Biden, the state director for the 2008 Obama-Biden presidential campaign, White House staffer, senior agency liaison in the executive office of the president, and the communications director for Delaware's insurance commissioner. In addition to serving as a faculty member at Rutgers, Marla is currently serving as the Senior Strategic Advisor to the Delaware's Congresswoman Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester in her bid for re-election in November. That's a mouthful. Marla is super busy and is so valuable here to us at the school. We're excited that you can be with us here today, Marla.
Thank you, Marian. And I am just so happy and just excited about this wonderful Zoom. This is something that is important, and I am excited to really talk about how voting is social work. So, before we get started though, because we're going to talk about 3 key questions that we really need to answer. But before we get to those questions, we wanted to launch a couple polls to see where people are in this voting season. Here's the first one. As a matter of fact, as a social worker, how important or unimportant is helping clients and or communities to vote to your practice? So how important is it to your practice? Let's see what's going on here. Okay. Well, I would assume that this would be very important to you if you're on this Zoom call. I don't see anyone that's neutral. But yeah, I'm excited to see so far. We still have a few minutes left to do this. I want to take it to a minute, give people a chance to change their mind. But it looks like all of you feel that this is something that is very important. But we have a couple that don't think that it's important to your practice, I assume. So hopefully after this presentation, we will see differently in a poll. It looks like 2/3 of you believe that it is very important. So we look forward to changing the minds of those that have stated that it is very unimportant or somewhat unimportant. Let's go to the next one. As a social worker, how important or unimportant is helping? Oh, that's the same question. Oh, let me share the results. Okay. Here's the next question coming up. I think I shared those, relaunch poll 1.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. How often do you vote in a federal election? And then the second part to that is how often do you vote in a state election? Let's see what's happening here. Okay. So we have some civic-minded social workers on the Zoom, I see. I see that you always vote. It's interesting, and it will be interesting to hear from Tanya that I know historically people are more engaged every 4 years. and not so much in the state and local elections, which is something that we hope to change some minds on this call, that every election is important. So, okay. So there go the results. 72% say always, and 50% in state elections, and 39%. So you see, as we go, it's almost as if the perception that the federal election is the most important, and that's why people are more engaged. Or maybe it's because you have more information and there's more energy around the national elections as opposed to local elections. But we know that, you know, all politics is local. And so we really want to make sure that we get people engaged on the local level. So let's go to the third poll. Not quite sure.
Have you ever encouraged others to register to vote? The first
Okay.
part of the sentence is at the top in the green.
Okay, gotcha. That kind of threw me
Yes,
off.
not clear.
So yes, this question is to determine whether or not you've been involved in voter registration before or helping people to vote. Or is this something that is new to you, something that you would like to learn more about and get some tools or develop skills in order to be able to do that? Let's see here. Okay, so it looks like, all right. Educated others on issues related to voting. Yes. So now, based on these polls, those that are on this call are engaged, are informed, and are looking for more information probably when it comes to how can you do it better? How can you reach more people? With yesterday being National Voter Registration Day, we know that we have a short window between now and November 3rd to get people out to the polls. So our job here this morning is to give you the tools, is to talk about you know, what needs to happen. And 95% of you have encouraged people to register to vote. So we want to give you the tools so that you know how to help them to register, and also how to get them to turn out on election day. So thank you so much for participating in the polls. That was fantastic. It gives us an opportunity to see where we're starting from. And I wanted to start though with a quote from John Lewis, the great congressman that was just a champion for voters' rights and for civil rights. And he says that ours is not the struggle for one day, for 1 year, for 1 week. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. And so I think the reason why I wanted to share that, especially on the day that, you know, we honor Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we, you know, focus on voting, we look at these two giants in John Lewis and in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we see them as social justice giants. But in their passing, we also see that they were human. They were people just like you and I. And they did extraordinary things with their time here on earth. We can do the same thing by being engaged in voting, by helping people to understand that they can play a part in creating change in the world. And that is our responsibility as social workers. So I want to introduce you to two people that are committed to this work. They inspire me. One from Gen Z, who I believe, as a book that I'm reading right now, the generation that is going to save us all. She's doing wonderful work at the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and her name is Nicole Taylor. And then the other presenter today is Tanya Rhodes Smith. And so, you know, it's funny, being someone in social work that has been involved in politics my whole life. I'm 53, even though I don't look it, but since I was 9 years old, I was involved in politics, and I've always seen it as social work. And to know the woman that created the center, that decided to focus on voting as social work, is an honor. And so, you know, I hope all of you gain a lot from what is shared in their presentation. Immediately following their presentation, we will open it up to you, and you can ask questions, and hopefully we will be there to answer them. But we are going to share with you some key dates and deadlines, ways to really get people engaged, and just to make you feel good about how to educate voters. I think it is our obligation and responsibility, because social justice is one of our 6 core values. So with that, let me read the bios of my 2 wonderful panelists, and we'll go from there. Okay, let's see. So we'll start with Tanya. Tanya Rhodes Smith, MSW, is the director of the Nancy Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work and an instructor in residence at the UConn School of Social Work. She is also co-founder of the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, Voting is Social Work. As director, she has overseen the expansion of the Institute's Campaign School for Social Workers, which has trained 2,000 social workers, more than 2,000 social workers, to run for office and lead in politics, and supports nonprofit voter engagement as a social work intervention. Tanya is a political social worker and advocate. Her experience includes policy practice, legislative advocacy, community organizing, and research. Her previous employers include the Bridgeport Child Advocacy Coalition, Person to Person, and the Center for Family Justice. She also served as a facilitator and coach for the Leadership Development Roundtable, as well as a volunteer for numerous nonprofit boards and political campaigns. Thank you for joining us, Tanya. And our next presenter, along with Tanya, will be Nicole Taylor. Nicole Taylor is a senior program manager at the Andrew Goodman Foundation, focusing on strategic partnerships and working with Wisconsin campus teams. She graduated from Hamilton College with her Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Government. Oh, interesting combo there. As a student, Nicole partnered with the Campus Vote Project and Hamilton College faculty and administrators to found Hamilton's voter engagement organization, Ham Votes. She chaired the Ham Votes student ambassador team and led their voter registration, education, and turnout efforts throughout 2018. Nicole is a passionate and civic, she is passionate about civic and voter engagement, particularly among students, and is excited to empower Vote Everywhere ambassadors to make the ballot more accessible on their campuses. Please join me in raising your hands and giving a little, go get them, y'all. Voting is social work. Let's hear about it, Tanya.
Thank you, Marla. It's so fun to be with another passionate political social worker. And I'm really pleased to be here with Nicole, Democracy Warrior, and all of you. I'm so honored. I'm a proud Husky, and Rutgers has always been, you know, in my circle. So it's really an honor to be with all of you today, social change agents and social warriors and social workers. So I'm going to start with a short video just to get us warmed up to talk about voting and the importance of voter engagement and voter turnout to social work practice. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's just hope this all works. I even know the right clicks to make. And, oh, wrong screen. Hold on. Let me stop that share. Sorry about that. I have two here. I want to share screen two, and there we go.
Yaritza, Burgos, Christopher Carmichael, Tina Carmichael, Randy Burkhead, Christopher Carter, Edward Rachel.
I couldn't vote. I was purged off the rolls. I was highly upset about it. I want to vote.
I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Mom, I don't want to hear about Selma anymore. We can actually go and vote. So I thought. Oh,
there's a plan. Oh, there's definitely a plan. People will go to great lengths to keep people from being free.
Whoever this guy is has challenged my right to vote.
It's about time we turned the lights on in the kitchen and started cleaning the cockroaches out of here.
Sheriff wanted him at labor strings.
He pretty much knew that he wasn't supposed to vote. It was just catch me if you can, or ha ha ha.
He said I use somebody's identity for voting. I'm not guilty.
When we think something like voting rights is something everybody believes and that progress only goes in one direction, we've seen sudden reverses. We've seen that history can go in the wrong direction.
There is a temptation for the majority to restrict voting rights of the minority because it helps them stay in power.
Those of us who are the descendants of people who were lynched, when you come from that kind of lineage, you're not going to allow some loudmouth bigot to intimidate you.
You see what's happening? The process is rigged. This whole election is being rigged.
Somebody's got to say this is not right, and somebody's got to say this is wrong.
So I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second while I pull up my other
vaccines.
So that we, let's see.
We see that prior to the approval process.
Okay. So that movie, which is available for free for all of you, I encourage you to watch it. And it really focuses on intentional voter suppression tactics as a strategy for winning elections. But there are also unintentional, are actually implicit voter suppression tactics that are built into our democracy. And so I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to start my presentation. And thank you for your patience as I navigate all this. I'm slideshow. I know it's here, right? No, sorry, I never use Google Slides. So Nicole, where do I do it?
Go to view and then click present.
Ah, thank you. Nicole saves me here. So we're going to talk today a little bit about voting as a social work intervention in all levels of practice. I'm going to go quickly today. So you can save your questions. I'll be happy to answer them, and we will send more information at the end. But we have a lot to cover, so if I look like I'm not breathing, I'm just trying to get it through all of it. And so I want to first start with why voting and voter turnout matter to social work's mission, our ethical mandate, and our impact in communities, and really examine nonpartisan voter engagement as an important intervention in micro, meso, and macro social work practice. And then we're going to look at what that looks like. How do we operationalize that? And in that, we're going to take a deep dive with Nicole in terms of figuring out how what all of us can do. You're going to leave with some action steps and hopefully be inspired to be not just active in this election, but in every election. Mm-hmm. And as we saw in the movie, white supremacy and anti-Black racism were built into the foundation of our democracy, and they persist today, implicitly and explicitly. We know that the pandemic has magnified the barriers to voting and forced many communities and many people to choose between their right to vote and their health, and in the backdrop of people who are calling the election rigged to begin with. So what we know, or what we believe, is that all forms of disenfranchisement and voter suppression threaten legitimacy of a democracy. And so what we want you to understand is that this is a really critical time. It's always been critical and it has always mattered. Otherwise, people wouldn't work so hard to keep people out of, keep people from voting. And I want you to understand that it's a manufactured narrative, and that these systemic barriers really work to suppress the vote because they also create this narrative that your vote doesn't matter. So let's look at 2016 for a minute. First of all, this is a startling picture. More people did not vote than voted for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And that's in a federal election where we have the highest voter turnout compared to state and local. So 100 million voters stayed home. And what we know about non-voters is that they are more likely to be lower income, they're more likely to be less educated, non-white, and unmarried. And that these, as I said earlier, these systemic barriers really feed these engagement barriers and really support this myth that the system is rigged, the system that my vote doesn't matter, and even the narrative of when people say, you know, I don't like politics. You know, that is really a design feature. And when we spoke about turnout for state and local elections, you know, you're not far off the mark here, because you reported in our unofficial poll that 72% of you said you vote in every federal election. That's slightly higher than the 67% that turned out in 2016. 50% is on the mark. That's about the average for state elections turnout, and 39% is a little higher because that's the average of 25%. But when you think about 1 in 4 people turning out in an election, that's the average. So what we know is that communities that are really underserved have the lowest voter turnouts, and because they face more barriers to voting. Voting is hyper-local, it is highly administrative, and it is also very, very complicated, and we'll talk about that. But when we look at these local elections, and what I want all of you to commit to is really the importance of local and state elections, because this is where policing policy happens. This is where clean water, schools, elections, housing, all the things that affect our daily lives are determined on the state and local level. And oftentimes it can be more accountable to residents, but not if you're not voting. Because elected officials, and I'll say this probably 5 times before I finish, elected officials pay attention to communities and individuals that vote. And so when 10% of a community, or 15% or 20% are voting in an election, that's the group that has the power. And that power can often be really toxic. If we think about some political cities where it feels like things are rigged or are corrupt, well, probably if you look at the voter turnout, it's very low. And it creates a sort of toxic power system. So voter turnout is good for everybody. And the other thing I want to say about local elections is that oftentimes if you have an area, it can fall on either side, either party. But if there is one party that dominates in an area, it also means that the primaries are critical, and the turnout for primaries is even lower than general elections, because a primary will determine who wins in November or who wins in the general election. So primaries are critically important. Don't forget them. Whoops. And you know, at the Humphreys Institute, we really want to support a healthy, inclusive democracy. And the way I define inclusive democracy is a democracy that responds to the needs of all people. And to have a healthy, inclusive democracy, that we need both participation through voting and we need representation through at all levels of government. And so at the Humphreys Institute, as we mentioned earlier, we do train social workers to get involved on campaigns and run for office, and particularly to support communities who've been or social workers and candidates who've been historically excluded from circles of power and office. So I'm going to go back to these structural barriers and talk for a little bit, and I know Nicole will also speak to these a little bit, but think about the process of voting and how complicated it is. And I want you all, as you are voters in this cycle, to really think about, first of all, how do I get an absentee ballot? you know, one of the #1 barriers for students in the absentee ballot process is a stamp. So, you know, there's a whole process, and every state, again, is different. There's confusing rules. The deadlines, the deadline to vote in some states is a month before, to register is a month before, and in some states you can register and vote on the same day. In some states you can participate in a primary if you are an unaffiliated voter. In many states you can't. The rules are different state to state. These elections are run on a hyper-local way, so we all have to be paying attention to our community. Who owns the voter rolls, as we saw in that movie, matters, and those are highly administrative oftentimes. So a name change can be difficult. And we looked and saw that law enforcement, you know, that man who was incarcerated for voting allegedly under his father's name, that was in Texas. The other piece that I want you to understand is that voting with a felony conviction is different in all 50 states. And so in all 50 states, we have different rules around who can vote. And in 2 states, we don't have any restriction on people who have a felony conviction. So that's Maine and Vermont, which happen to be the 2 whitest cities or states in our country. And that's not by accident. We would argue that all forms of felony disenfranchisement should be eliminated, that they were founded with racist intent, and that they have a racist impact in the way that our criminal justice system is administered. So you have these felony disenfranchisement rules. So in some states you can vote while you're on parole. In some states you can vote while you're on probation. In some states you have to wait until the end. In some states you lose the right forever. In some states you have to get a pardon. I mean, think about that. Think about how you know. And the penalties are severe. So there was a woman in Texas who voted in 2016, who'd been released from prison, rebuilding her life. It was a white-collar minor crime, released from prison. Mom says, you should go vote, you know, rebuild your life. And she did. But she didn't know that she couldn't vote while she was on parole. And so she didn't even actually vote because she wasn't on the rolls. She filled out a provisional ballot and somebody reported her, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. So that's why. That's voter suppression right there. So, so all of these ID rules, purging voter lists, challenging student registrations, all of this is creating this narrative. And, you know, we can spend a whole hour on gerrymandering, but this whole idea of drawing districts for partisan and actually oftentimes what's been in the courts has been drawing lines based on race, which has been thrown out. But we know that partisan gerrymandering exists today, and that there's a great report from the Brennan Center. And I'm going to do a time check here. I'm already running out of time here. But from the Brennan Center that shows that if you are communities that have more African Americans and Latinx voters wait longer in line to vote. So again, we know that people don't vote for a lot of reasons, and here are some reasons that circle through Tufts University report from young people. But I want to say one thing, that 40%, overall, 40% of people don't vote because they think the system is rigged, they don't like politics, they don't like the candidates, their vote doesn't matter. Those are engagement barriers, and social workers are great at engagement barriers. What we know about voting is you can't just say you should. That you really have to do a little bit more work on that. And so when we think about voting as a social work intervention, we're looking at the micro level. You know, what do people need to be informed voters? They have to know how to register. They need information on when, where, and how to vote. They need information on the candidates. And that's particularly difficult in local and state elections. Look up your candidates in your community. See how easy it is to find nonpartisan information. I think you'll find that it's more difficult than it should be. At the meso level, really getting out the message that voting leads to collective power, and that when you stay home, you actually reduce the power of your entire community. And at the macro level, really addressing these systemic barriers and working for voting rights and access. What we know about voting is that it's good for people. This practice of voting is good for people, and it's good for communities. Voting is a social determinant of health. Individuals who vote have better outcomes on in lots of different ways. And communities that vote are better off, and there's a lot of research that shows and backs up that whole mantra I said earlier: elected officials pay attention and give resources to communities that vote in higher rates. So what we know is that communities that vote have better schools, have higher rates of employment, they rebound from recession faster, they have oftentimes better roads and streets, like they get more resources. And even if you look within a city, you can sometimes really map the power in a city by voter turnout. So I encourage all of you to take a deep dive on the voter stats in your communities. Voting is also an important human right. It is an act of power, individually and collectively. So what we want you to see is that it is central to our mission. It is our most important tool for systemic change. You know, we can work on the individual level forever and not fix the issues that and the system that hurts the communities that we serve. For those of you who are heading into clinical social work, I hope all of you will read this report. This Cheryl Aguilar and the NASW Mental Health Committee put out a fantastic piece on integrating voter engagement into clinical practice. Because the other thing that we hear a lot is clinicians that will say, you know, politics is not part of my practice, this isn't relevant to me. And what we say is that it is tremendously relevant, because again, voting is an act of power, and it has been shown to offset some effects of discrimination. Asking somebody about their registration status is an important tool and information point. So again, social workers are great at connecting people with information. So we believe that this does belong, and we also know that it's going to be different for every social worker and every agency, but that it doesn't mean it can't be done. It means that we have to do it thoughtfully. I will encourage all of you to integrate voting activities into your educational contracts, since I'm sure many of you are putting them together right now. Here's a shout out for that, because they tie to all 9 core competencies. And before I turn it over, I mean, you know, I want you to know that these concerns about partisanship, violating the rules, losing their funding, these are some of these reasons that social workers and agencies don't do this. But this work, nonpartisan, you're never telling people who to vote for, but nonpartisan voter engagement is legal, it is ethical. And in some cases, if you're registering people for federal benefits, it's required by law. And so I'll leave you on this last slide to sort of imagine what the culture would look like if every social worker, we touched, according to the director of the executive director of NASW, Angela McLean, social workers touch 12 million lives a day. And imagine if every social worker and social service agency in all these settings encouraged people to register, made sure that they had all the information that they needed, that they helped them address and make a voting plan, and that they really reminded them that their vote matters. So I will share these slides and all of it, and I'll be around for questions. But I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Nicole, who's doing amazing work at the Andrew Goodman Foundation. So Nicole, I'm gonna turn your slides, correct?
Yeah, I think that works.
Either way, it doesn't matter, whatever's easiest for you.
Yeah, let's stick with this, and then I can just cue for the next slide so we don't take too much time switching over. Okay. But hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to Marla and all the folks at the Rutgers School of Social Work, and to Tanya for doing such a wonderful job putting together this presentation, because this is a really, really important topic. Voting obviously in 2020 is incredibly important, and Tanya did a really great job of sharing a lot of the hurdles that young people, elderly, incarcerated, like there's so many constituencies that face a lot of barriers to the ballot. And actually the reason that I'm so excited to be with this group is because social workers are a leading force in advocating for social and political equity, and you all have so much power to vote yourselves, but also to encourage your clients, your families, your friends, your peers on campus to be engaging in the electoral process. So again, thank you so much for having me. And I think what I'm gonna focus on a little bit more today is some of the action steps that you can take and tools that you can use to really be advocates for voting. So if we could head over to the next slide, please. Thank you. So first, I want to talk about the Andrew Goodman Foundation and share a little bit more about our organization because it's so tied to the work that you all do. So the Andrew Goodman Foundation is inspired by our namesake Andrew Goodman, who joined the Freedom Summer Project in 1964 as part of the Civil Rights Movement. And went to Mississippi with James Chaney and Michael Schwerner to register Black Americans to vote at a time when they certainly had no rights in the South to vote. And on one of their first nights down in Mississippi, working as part of the Freedom Summer Project, they were murdered by the KKK. And their murders really were so tragic to the nation, but catalyzed this movement to oppose, white supremacy and voter suppression and all of these things that were really disenfranchising, so many groups, but especially Black Americans back in the 60s. And I think now we see all the parallels today. And I think Tanya did a really nice job demonstrating the parallels between, the lack of rights that Black Americans had in the 60s during civil rights movement and today. But another thing that I wanted to bring up is actually Michael Schwerner, who was part of this trio, was a social worker. And, the reason that he joined the civil rights movement was he wanted to work to reshape the systems that created inequality and created the marginalization that Black Americans and Jewish Americans and so many others were experiencing, so many people of color were experiencing. And so that's why social work and all of this is so nicely and deeply tied to our mission to make young voices and votes a powerful force in democracy. So if we can go to the next slide. So with all of that said, I want to talk about one of our programs as part of the Andrew Goodman Foundation. So we have our Vote Everywhere program, through which we work with college campuses to make the ballot more accessible to students. We work with colleges in particular because Andy was a college student. He was 20 years old. He was attending Queens College in New York City after he transferred from UW-Madison up in Wisconsin. But he was a college student, and the Freedom Summer Project was led by college students. The volunteers were college students. So it's so deeply personal for us to work with college students. And so what we do through our Vote Everywhere program is we work with over 80 college campuses nationwide, including Rutgers, New Brunswick. And we provide resources, training, advising, support, some funding to do all different types of voter engagement work. And the work that our students do. So we have ambassadors in our Vote Everywhere program that are students on campus because it's so important to make sure we're pulling from our relational organizing strategies, meaning, we're leveraging the power of peer-to-peer contact. When you talk to your friends about voting and your clients about voting, it's going to have a much greater impact than if I were to talk to your friends about voting because they don't know me. So that's why we have our student ambassadors, and the work that they do falls into several different buckets, starting with voter registration, voter education, get out the vote, and then some advocacy projects that tend to be based on what's happening in your particular state, in your locality, on your campus, because as Tanya mentioned, voting and election laws are different state to state to state, which makes it really difficult to navigate, especially if you're a student that's from out of state attending Rutgers. But there are some really important things to know that I can talk about in our next few slides. But we'll get to those. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but these will be shared after our time together today. But here you can see a history of voting in the United States. And I think it's really clear that when our country was founded, when the Declaration of Independence was written, when our Constitution was designed, not everyone was granted the right to vote. Not everyone was created equal. Not everyone had the same rights. And, you know, over the past 200-300 years, we've been very slowly chipping away at that, but we're still not there yet. I think all of the different voter suppression tactics that Tanya talked about, and I can share more about, really demonstrate that we're not there yet. But the one provision on this slide that I do want to highlight is the 26th Amendment, because the 26th Amendment is something that's really important to the work that we do, especially with the Andrew Goodman Foundation. We try to encourage young people to vote. Every year, like hundreds of thousands of young people turn 18 and are newly eligible to vote. And that's only because of the 26th Amendment, which was just passed in 1971. Originally, you had to be 21 years old to be guaranteed the right to vote. And this reduced that voting age to 18. And so now, you know, young people that are, you know, college age, high school age now are able to cast their ballot. And so that's, you know, what a lot of our work is fueled on. So we could go to the next slide. Okay, so Tanya touched on this a little bit, but I want to really hammer home well, one of the biggest problems with voting is right now, but also, like, what are some solutions? How can we overcome these problems? Because even though all this voter suppression and all these issues exist, there are so many, like, tools in our toolbox at our disposal to overcome all of these barriers and move past these quote unquote problems. And the one that I want to point out is that, you know, especially in 2020, young people ages 18 to 24, college age students, are one of the largest voting blocs in the United States. And, you know, we have data from 2014 that shows that only 18% of young people voted in 2014, compared with about 37% of the overall population. And you can see on some of these charts sort of where different, like, age demographics fall in terms of their voting rates. And I know these numbers are from 2014, but this data is remaining consistent over time. And I think it's really important in 2020 for us to shift this tide and make it so that, you know, young people are the largest voting bloc. We need to make sure we're voting at the highest rates. It's incredibly important, because when we don't vote, we are giving away our power to folks that might not have our best interests in mind. And so that's why, if we move on to the next slide, oh, okay. Well, before we get to what I was about to say, this next slide actually shares your NSOLVE report. So NSOLVE is the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. I pulled the report for Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And what this does is it captures the voting rate of students on your campus. And so I pulled this one because this is the campus that we work with and that we have student ambassadors on. But what you can see is that in 2018, and this is just of, you know, eligible voters on your campus, 42.8% of students, and those are graduate students, undergraduate, turned out to vote. And, you know, this was a 31% increase, almost 32% increase from 2014. But it's still, you know, it's still not good enough. We're the largest voting bloc. We need to get our numbers way, way, way up. And so, but what is sort of a silver lining is that of sort of this constituency on this call, we see that from 2014 to 2018, 61.9% of you turned out to vote, and that's compared to almost 30% in 2014. So, you know, I know social work students and public administration students are really increasing the rate at which they're voting, but there's more work to do, not only because we want to see this number be 100%, but also because you have the power to really be encouraging all the students on your campus to vote and getting all these other numbers up. So if we can move to the next slide. Oh, okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because we've talked a lot about voter suppression today and it's a little bit repeat. But one thing that I do want to bring up that hasn't been touched on is COVID-19. Obviously, we know that COVID-19 is changing our entire lives. Like, as we know it, it's changing the election as we know it. It's in the news every single day. And the thing about COVID-19 is it's really exacerbating those statutory barriers that have always existed. Deadlines, absentee ballot request forms, like early voting, felon disenfranchisement. It's making all of those issues like bigger or different or highlighted in other ways. But what COVID-19 is also doing is, with different polling sites having, less staffing, or, some elected officials are saying to use mail-in voting and some are saying that you shouldn't. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of conflicting information out there. And so hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll have cleared some of that up. So we could move to the next slide. So here are, before we head into some of the actual practices that you can use to encourage students to vote, I wanted to share some resources, and I'll make sure that these end up on your website, and I can try to share some in the chat when I'm done. But your campus has what's called our My Vote Everywhere page. On that website, you can register to vote, you can request your absentee ballot, you can find out where your polling place is. You can also fill out the census. You can sign up to be a poll worker. You can learn about so many things. I definitely encourage you to visit that site. There are a lot of different buttons and clickables that really facilitate anyone engaging in the electoral process. And then the couple other resources that I'm sharing here are Campus Vote Project State Student Guides, which tells you everything you need to know about every single state in the country when it comes to student voting. And then we also have our Ambassador Handbook, which serves as sort of a training tool for how you can engage students in the electoral process. So if we could move on to the next slide. So I wanted to share some best practices for voter registration, because even with all the voter suppression tactics that are out there, there's so many things that you can do. And here we see some things that maybe were done before COVID-19 sort of came into our lives, but there are also, there are a lot of remedies to the challenges COVID-19 has thrown at us, and some things that you can do. And so, I see a question in the chat that I want to address. Mail-in ballots are being sent to all registered voters in New Jersey. That's a good catch. That is true. So with COVID-19 restrictions, there's still so many things you can do, whether that's outdoor tabling with socially distanced, wearing your mask. There are social media campaigns. There are these virtual voter information tools like My Vote Everywhere. You can send campus-wide emails. You can text bank. There's so many things that you can do in terms of outreach to make sure that you're helping others register to vote, while it's also important to make sure you're registered. But in addition to that, there's also virtual advocacy for more accessible voter registration options. So even just extending the voter registration deadline, currently it's October 13th, but there's some advocacy that you could do to extend that to even later. Some states have same-day voter registration, which means you can register on election day if you need to. And there are several other advocacy projects that, if you're interested, you can ask about after the presentation. But so many things you can do for voter reg, even in this virtual space. So if we could go to the next slide. There are, I was seeing the question in the chat. I think I'm going to answer it in one of my slides. There are also voter education best practices during COVID-19 to make sure that yourselves and your peers and your clients and whoever is in your circle has the information that they need. You can host candidate forums, you can host debate watch parties, civil dialogues, but nonpartisan. That's actually something I want to flag. Making sure that all the work that you're doing is nonpartisan makes your different advocacy efforts so much more inclusive, where anyone, regardless of their political affiliation, can register, can learn about what's on their ballot, can be engaged, because it's really important for everyone to be able to exercise their voice. And generally, being nonpartisan for AGF just means that we don't endorse any political candidates or political parties or like specific positions on issues. And so honestly, the way to get around that is to just share the facts. If you're talking about nonpartisan issue-based education and the issue that is really important to your constituency is climate change, you know, just share the facts of climate change. Like, share what each side is of the political aisle is saying about it, and then let the folks that you're engaging make their own decisions. So making sure you're not swaying anyone, but just that they have the information that they need. And then you see there are some other things that you can do in terms of voter education. But if we could go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about Get Out the Vote, which is how we actually make sure that folks are casting their ballots. And so some of the best practices for doing this are helping folks pledge to vote. So on our My Vote Everywhere page, we have a pledge to vote tool, which actually facilitates making a voting plan. So how will you vote? Will you vote on election day, early, or absentee or by mail? When will you vote? So, you know, what day, what time, depending on the method you've chosen, and where will you vote? Will it be at the mailbox? Will it be on your couch? Will it be at your county clerk's office? Or will it be at your polling site? And making a voting plan is actually one of the biggest barriers to casting a ballot, because if you have work, if you have class, if you miss a deadline, that can make it really challenging to vote. So making sure you make a plan ahead of time so that you can reach your benchmarks, reach your deadlines, and get that ballot out there is most important. And one other GOTV tactic that I want to highlight before we move on from this slide is vote tripling. And vote tripling is just that idea of relational organizing that I talked about earlier. When you register to vote, when you cast your ballot, when you request your absentee ballot, which I guess you don't need to do in New Jersey, but in other states you do, text 3 friends. As soon as you take that action, text 3 of your friends and say, hey, I registered to vote. You should do it too. And that a lot of that was happening yesterday on National Voter Registration Day. And as we continue on, there are a lot of different touch points where you can be texting or calling your friends and encouraging them to do the same. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, great. So here are our calls to action. So after, you know, everything that we've shared with you today, there's some things that we really encourage you to do as soon as you get off this call. The first is to register to vote. Make sure you are registered, whether you did it yesterday during National Voter Registration Day or you still have yet to register. It's really important to make sure that your voter registration is taken care of. And you can check your voter registration status on our My Vote Everywhere page, which I'll send the link out to. Or you can, you know, honestly just call your local clerk, your local elections clerk, and make sure. But it's really important to put your own mask on before you put on someone else's. You know, before you get out there and register others, make sure you're registered yourself. The second call to action is to make your voting plan. We just talked about what making a voting plan entails. So make sure, you know, use our pledge to vote tool, but make sure that you know what you're going to do to make sure that your ballot is received and counted. Our third call to action is to sign up to be a poll worker. Now there's a little asterisk on this one because, you know, in New Jersey, there is going to be limited accessibility to in-person polling sites because Governor Murphy is encouraging vote by mail as sort of the most prevalent voting method, but there will be some in-person voting sites open, especially for those with disabilities, the elderly, just folks that need access to the in-person site. So if you are not at high risk for COVID-19 and if you are able to get the day off from work or class, I definitely encourage you to sign up to be a poll worker, and we have a tool on our My Vote Everywhere page that can help facilitate that. So our fourth call to action is to share. After you've done these first 3 steps, reach out to your network and your field agency and make sure that you're sharing out information with your network. Have conversations about issues and why voting is important. And then the 5th call to action is to educate others on a couple other pieces. You know, it's really important to fill out the census. The census is so deeply connected to voting and elections. We need to have 100% participation in the census to make sure that the different representatives that were allocated at local, state, and federal government levels are actually proportional to the number of people in our districts and in our municipalities. So filling out the census is incredibly important. There's a link here. We also have a button on our My Vote Everywhere page. But if you care about voting, you should also care about the census. And as Tanya said, there are still a few days left to do that. Make sure you're educating others on the different levels of government. In the poll, several of you said that you don't always vote in state and local elections, but it's actually like more important than ever to vote at those levels of government. And I really think COVID-19 has done, I hate to say this, but a nice job of demonstrating why local and state government matters. It's your county, it's your state that is setting mandates for wearing masks and closing different, local businesses or reopening or whatever is happening in your county. And it's local government that's been making those decisions. And so it's so important to engage in those levels of government. And finally, just making sure that others understand that the issues that they care about are connected to voting. Like even, I was a math major. I would talk to STEM students all the time, and you talk to a pre-med student and they're like, well, like, I'm just going to be a doctor. I don't care about politics. Well, actually, I think we really see here that healthcare is so deeply tied to what the decisions our elected officials are making. And so all issues are connected to voting. So if we can move on to the next slide, I think this is our last one. So I just want to point out, through our calls to action, here are some days of activation. A few of them have passed, but that's okay. National Poll Worker Recruitment Day was on September 1st, but there's still plenty of time to sign up to be a poll worker if that's something you can do. National Voter Registration Day was yesterday, but you still have until October 13th to register in New Jersey. Then there's also National Voter Education Week, which is a week filled with all sorts of different like social media campaigns, and then local campaigns that will make sure that everyone has what they need to understand the voting process and learn about what's on their ballot. October 24th is Vote Early Day, which promotes all the different early voting options, whether your state has in-person early voting, absentee or mail-in voting, or in-person absentee, and there are some distinctions there. But in New Jersey, Vote Early Day will really be focused on getting your mail-in ballots returned. And then, of course, on November 3rd is Election Day, and that's sort of our what we have our sights focused on as we're going through all of these next couple months. But with that, I think that was actually our last slide. So I think we're ready to stop our screen share and take any questions you might have.
Great. So we are going to take questions from students. You can either raise your hand and then we'll, unmute, or we can read your question from the chat if you would like to post something. I just wanted to pose something to our two presenters. First of all, thank you so much for the information. It was a lot. It was like drinking water out of a fire hose, but I'm grateful that you're going to share the slides with us. And I think that what you shared was very important, looking at voter suppression and understanding that the young vote really could be so important in this election right now. We've said it time and time again. If the young folks show up, man, this is how it's going to be. And they've yet to show up. I think this time will be different. Looking at the Parkland students, looking at the way that the Black Lives Matter movement has come together because of the energy of Gen Z and the younger millennials. And so I have great hope that this election, we will see that youth vote. But let's see what's going on here. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, you talked about misinformation. I wanted to ask you about disinformation, about individuals that are working to create and or disrupt this process as a form of suppression. How can we as social workers help in combating disinformation, knowing that, I read somewhere where they said something like 50% of Americans get their news from Facebook. So we know that social media, it plays a big part in where we get our information. And that's where disinformation is really running rampant. What can we do individually, just, beyond, anything else, education? How can we be effective in that way? So I pose that to both you, Nicole, and you, Tanya, even though, Nicole, I know that young folks are off of Facebook now that us old folks are on it, but, in other areas where younger people are communicating, how can we combat the disinformation?
Nicole, you want me to start and then you jump in? Because I think you'll have some great things to say too. I will share the Knight Foundation, and I encourage all of you to go to the 100million.org, the100million.org, I think it is. But in that examination of who did not vote in 2016, one of the startling or one of the findings is that non-voters also were more passive consumers of news. So voters tend to have multiple sources and actively seek out sources of news. Non-voters are much more likely to be passive. So getting it from social media and from, news that's fed to them. And I don't have, I think this is a larger societal conversation, but I do think that social workers have a role in educating people on complex issues. And I teach political advocacy. And one of the things that I think is most important just as a starting point is to create fact sheets on important issues. How do you create a fact sheet? Because that's generally what you get when you go to a legislative office, right? You get 3 bullet points, but how do you take complex issues, break them down into very simple concepts? And then I think it's, Nicole and your generation that figure out in creative ways to educate through social media. I loved the thing I loved the most was your vote plan, that orange graphic you had. I think we need to spend time as a profession and as students thinking about how we communicate and set the record straight to fight these narratives.
Right. Thank you. What do you think, Nicole?
Yeah, this is a really great and important question. Disinformation is a big problem right now. There's just so much out there. I think getting your news from social media, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it can work. But if that's where you're going to be primarily consuming your news, then you're going to have to do a little bit of legwork to make sure that you're confirming that it's accurate and confirming that it's not biased towards one side or the other, that it's not just like blatantly wrong. And I think there are actually some resources that I would point you towards. First of all, like I have to plug AGF, follow us on Instagram and social, Facebook and Twitter. And we always put out trusted nonpartisan information. It goes through multiple layers of review. But also there's actually a news source that I consume some of my news from, and it's called The Flip Side. And so they'll send daily emails, but also have a bunch of news just on their website. And what they do is, every day they'll pick an issue to spotlight. And so I think on Monday, it was the Supreme Court after the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so they were talking about like what the process is for replacing Justice Ginsburg and, all those things connected to that. But what they do is they pull quotes from the left, from the right, and from the middle. And they say, here's what everyone is saying. Here are the facts of the situation. So this is like what the Constitution says. And so here's all the information on a silver platter for you. So now you can create your own opinion, see where you fall on this. And so that's actually a site that I think is really nice to combat disinformation and make sure you're getting balanced news.
Yeah, I think it's something that we have to be mindful of, that is our responsibility. Instead of just blocking people on Facebook or I don't like what he said, that a big part of our work is to, like Tanya said, correct and shape the narrative appropriately you know, with the right information. So I just wanted to, I wanted all of the students to also hear that, to understand that it is a responsibility for us to make sure that the information is credible and correct. And then another thing, speaking of credibility and trust in the process, a lot of individuals, you know, we already had voter skepticism anyway, but with the U.S. Postal Service having some issues, and although New Jersey is mailing everyone a mail-in ballot, how can we help with voter skepticism? Like, how can we get people to trust that their you know, vote will be counted? Are there ways to check? I am a Delawarean. And so in Delaware, when you submit your absentee ballot, you can go on, you know, on the website, and it shows when it was sent to you, when it was counted, you know, when it was recorded, and you can track it. Can you help the students understand the process and how we can help them to come up with what they would say to individuals that say, I think this whole thing is rigged, like we just said before? How can I trust that if I fill out my ballot and put it in that ballot box, that it's really going to be counted?
And can I add to that question, Nicole, for you? Can you clarify the mail-in voting process for New Jersey? Because I'm seeing mail-in ballots are being mailed, but I don't, is that true? Are they ballots or are they
actual ballots?
So they're getting ballots.
They're getting ballots.
Again, in our state, everyone's getting an application, not a ballot. So, you know, all of these different processes are contributing to that.
Exactly. And in Delaware, the same. We get an affidavit, and then you have to give a reason for voting absentee, which you can put down as COVID. So, you know, understanding that we have students from New York, New Jersey, all over the place, you know your laws in your state, and make sure that, you know, you give the appropriate information. You do not want to be someone that is misinforming people. But yeah, Nicole, let's talk a little bit about the mail-in process and voter skepticism. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I can touch on all of these things. So first and foremost, I think we've mentioned it a few times, but it's really important to know that every state sets their own rules. So there are different processes in every single state. In New Jersey, mail-in ballots are being sent to all registered voters. You don't need to request your ballot. You don't need to provide an excuse. You'll all be getting one in the mail. As a result of that, there will be limited in-person voting. And so what you would need to do is check the county where you're registered and to understand what in-person voting is available. But because you're all receiving mail-in ballots, it's the safest bet is to vote that way. In other states, there are all these different laws. If you visit My Vote Everywhere, you can see what all the different laws are in every state. And also those Canvas Vote Project state student guides tell you what the different laws are for mail-in and absentee voting in every state. So making sure that, you know, I think it's really important to combat this misinformation, to point people to the resources that have the facts. One of the worst things that you can do is, and one of the worst things I can do, I'll put it in first person, is speak out of turn. Like, I can only talk about the states I'm familiar with. I wouldn't have known, you know, what the absentee process is in Delaware. So I would have said, you know what, let me check that for you, or let me point you to a resource. So making sure that you use the resources that we're sending today to help others vote if they're voting in other states is super important to understand mail-in versus absentee versus in-person voting, especially during this election cycle. And the other thing that I'll say about, you know, voter skepticism and trusting the system is that, you know, I actually was on a webinar with the CEO, Amber McReynolds, for the Vote at Home Institute. And the Vote at Home Institute does all sorts of education work on all the different, essentially, early voting options. So, you know, what states have mail-in, what states have absentee, which I know those two, I can explain the difference between those two in a second, but like which states have early voting. And something that Amber said was really interesting, because there's so much out there in the news about, you know, the USPS is like running slow and you might not get your ballot and blah, 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 blah. But the reality is that the USPS is operating normally as they always have. And what you need to be mindful of is that whether it was 2018, 2019, 2020, or like 1950, anything that goes through the mail has a life cycle. Like you have to, first of all, like make sure that you print it out, have an envelope, have a stamp, drop it in your box. That mail needs to be processed. It takes time to get wherever it's going. And then if you need to get something in return, it takes time for like whoever received it to process it, put a stamp on it, and get it back to you. The life cycle of your ballot, I think ballots are being sent out actually this week in New Jersey to all registered voters. And so, you know, keep in mind, it could, depending on where you are, if you're in a rural area, it could take up to 2 weeks to get to you, or it could take as little as 3 days. You know, how fast or slow is your mail usually? Keep that in mind. And then keep in mind that it could take that same 3 days to 2 weeks to get back to where you're sending it. And so just making sure that you build in enough time for your mail to go through that typical life cycle of a piece of mail is super important. And when it comes to the USPS, you can trust that process. And if a clerk, like an elections clerk, receives your ballot, it will count. The asterisk to that is you need to make sure that you're signing everything you're supposed to sign. You're checking all the boxes you're supposed to check. Oftentimes, like, mistakes can be as little as, you know, when you receive your ballot, they give you an envelope to send it back in. Maybe you didn't sign the outside of the envelope. Maybe you didn't check that you were a citizen. There were so many little things that could make your ballot not count, but those are not that your vote is being turned away, but just that, like, maybe you made a minor mistake, and your clerks are supposed to reach out to you to make sure that you can cure those ballots. But that's where, like, you sort of have to take ownership of, like, your own vote and make sure that you're doing everything that you can to get that to count.
Thank you. I see Tanya responded to a great question from Alexis. So we are going to, I know that Tanya has to jump off, but before she does, I wanted to launch our last poll, which here it is. Do you feel prepared to help your communities to register to vote? And do you feel prepared to, why is that posted twice? While you guys are doing that, I wanted to
One's registering, one's actually voting. There's two different questions.
Oh, there you go. Voting in process. Okay. But I wanted to speak to, there was a quote that Tanya had on one of her slides from Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is an MSW and a US Senator. And we have a lot of elected officials that are social workers. And I look forward to working with Tanya more closely. I think it's something that I want all of you to consider, that long after this election, we should still be involved and engaged in the political process, including running for office. And Tanya, I just want to commend you for doing that. I know it's challenging running. I've run many campaigns for individuals, and money always seems to be the issue, especially for candidates of color and for women to raise the money to be competitive. And so I think it's important that we have the diversity in office so that we can address these problems in communities that are often ignored. So I appreciate you. Before you go, I just wanted to share that with you. And I also wanted to share a quote from another US Senator, Barbara Mikulski, who says that politics is social work with power. And I think we're always feeling powerless, you know, running into just so many challenges as we try to help our clients. But if we understand that there's power that we have access to through voting, through being an elected official, through knowing how to navigate the political structures, then we can really create the change that we need for our clients. And I think that, you know, it's important. And I hope that everyone on this call understands that. So Tanya, if you wanted to say something after looking at our last poll before you leave, I would greatly appreciate it. And Nicole, thank you so much for just being the voice and doing the work and representing Andrew Goodman and the foundation in the way that you have. I had the good fortune of crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis and meeting Andrew Goodman's brother. And I think sometimes we forget the sacrifice that people have made for us to have the right to vote. So I think we all need to fight a little bit harder. So Tanya, please continue.
Well said, Marla. And let me just thank all of you. Again, it's been incredible to be in community with all of you today. I'm so happy and look forward to working more with Nicole and collaborating on that. And you, Marla, I mean, it just, you know, this is what networking in politics looks like. It's getting to know each other. We are stronger together. So I am so thrilled to be a part of this today. Thank you for including me. And yes, social workers are really effective legislators. We have seven state representatives in our 7 state representatives and 1 senator in Connecticut. And it's not insignificant that 2 of the vice presidential candidates were social workers. You know, Val Demings and Karen Bass, and actually our trainer on day 1 of the campaign school, Kate Coyne McCoy, is now working for Val Demings. So, you know, we are powerful, we can make change, and I applaud all your efforts, and I'm, you know, get out the vote. So please reach out to me, votingisocialwork.org. We have a lot of resources for you, as does Nicole's, and you have all the information you need, and hopefully you got the encouragement and the energy for making a difference. And it's this election, and it's in all future elections. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Nicole, would you like to share anything before we wrap this all up?
I think Tanya just jumped, but I first wanted to say thank you so much to Tanya, and again to everyone on this call, and to Marla and all the folks at the Rutgers School of Social Work. It's really been an honor to be with you here today. And I guess in closing, my first priority is to make sure that you're all registered and ready to cast your ballot, and that you feel like you have the tools to do that. And my second priority is to make sure that you feel empowered and ready to help others do the same. So if you have any questions at all, I put a link in the chat earlier to our My Vote Everywhere page. We'll make sure that that's linked, but if you have any questions at all, you can email me. I just put my email in the chat. It's nicole.taylor@andrewgoodman.org. If you want to learn more about our program, if you want to become an ambassador, if you want to just engage in any way, always feel free to reach out to me. And I can, even if you just need to register to vote, I can help you navigate that process. So, you know, again, just offering my support, anything that any of you need. You're all part of the AGF network already. So thank you.
Awesome. So I guess I'll kick it back over to Marion, but I just want to remind you the call to action that Nicole shared at the very end of her slide, which is, you know, register to vote and make a plan and share with others, educate people and educate yourself so that you know what you're talking about. And you know, if you have the time and if you're in good health, become a poll worker, because, you know, we need to be involved in this work. So thank you so much. And Marion, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. That was really great. I think lots of comments coming in about how this was really helpful, how it's meaningful, inspirational, encouraging. So I think that students and faculty, everyone that's attending today is really feeling like this was helpful. We do have a couple of minutes, so if other questions, and it's Nicole, if you're okay staying on, and Marla, just for a couple more minutes, if other questions come up, if people need us to resend any links that were sent earlier, you know, the floor is open, so feel free. We're, you know, a small enough group where if you want to unmute and ask a question, feel free to do that as well.
Hi, I'm Alexis. I don't know if, so I sent an email, but I was really curious about the specific question I mentioned. about the 1976 campaign finance law, which basically ruled that money in politics is considered freedom of speech. So this basically allowed corporations to really fund lobbyists and politicians to really go in and kind of like almost neoliberalize just about like our whole entire system in a sense. So my question is, how at the point that we're at, how can we combat something that is so deeply rooted into our system and is basically like it's a part of what our system is now, or like in terms of government and in terms of all the policies that come out, and in terms of why our welfare state and why our qualities of life compared to other first world nations are the worst, like in a lot of different categories. So like for me, I do understand the importance of voting, but for me it just seems so like hopeless sometimes, just seeing just how corrupt and how broken everything is. So for me, I don't personally think that like you just need to vote like people out, because we've tried that and it's failed. So I don't know. I just wanted to hear some insight on that question.
So I'll jump in and take a stab at some of that. You know, I did, as Tanya was leaving, we talked briefly about, you know, some of the challenges that I too have seen in working with candidates running for office, individuals that are committed to the community, but don't have the resources, you know, to really launch a successful campaign. And yes, we do need campaign finance reform. That is something that we would like to have. And as we look at what's happening right now with the Supreme Court, because that's where that, you know, could really be addressed. Our voting dictates who gets on the Supreme Court. You know, even in voting for your congressperson, it affects what becomes law, you know, how we operate. So the vote is necessary and important. I think that the hopelessness is something that is kind of, like I said before about disinformation. It's something that kind of is just a part of politics, that we just don't trust it, we don't believe in it anymore. And that in order for us to change that, we have to run. We have to get qualified, good individuals in the process to change the direction that we're going in. In Delaware, we just had a primary, and in the primary, 4 seats were taken by millennials and Gen Z that won, and they beat incumbents that had served over 25, 30 years in the state legislature. And so, you know, we have to have, you know, candidates that are brave enough to challenge it in order for things to change, not to give up, but to believe that they themselves can be the solution. It's not just about money. It's about, you know, a bunch of people coming together, working together to create change. None of those candidates had money, but they knew enough people. So I think it requires us to get involved.
And if I could just add to that quickly, because that is an incredibly, incredibly important point that Marla just made. But civic engagement is more than just voting. There are ways that we can combat this feeling of hopelessness. You know, voting is something that you do a few times a year when you vote in primaries and general elections, but making sure that, you know, if there's a cause you really care about, you need to protest, you need to send letters, you need to call your representatives. Like we have the power to hold our elected officials accountable, not only at the ballot box, but through the year. And, you know, I've had a lot of friends that have had internships or worked in different different like elected officials' offices. And when you send a letter and you write an email and you give them a call, they hear and read all of it, and they mark it all down. And that's a fact. And so, you know, there are ways that you can make sure that your voice is heard, and that in the moment you're making sure that your elected officials are being held accountable to what you care about and what your communities care about. You know, we need to be active citizens all year long. And something like campaign finance reform is something that can be worked on all year long and on election day.
And Tanya spoke about this prior to leaving too, that, you know, the elected officials are responsive to the voters. If you're not a voter, they really are not focused on anyone that is not participating in the process. So, you know, it is our responsibility as good citizens, and as social workers, it is our obligation and our duty. So I think it's important. But thank you, Alexis, and, you know, keep hope alive. Don't give up.
Thank you both. We're approaching the end, so I thank you all for being here. And we will be posting this recording of the session on our website and our YouTube channel, so you can review this again. You can look at some of the resources we posted on the slides again, and definitely speak to each other about this. Make sure you're talking to your classmates, your neighbors, your family, your communities, to encourage each other to vote. Thank you.
Bye, guys. It was a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.